The streetlights died first, one by one, block by block, until the whole street outside Clara Whitmore's house went black, and the only sound left was her own pulse pounding in her ears. Then came the engines, dozens of them, rolling in low and quiet, no sirens, no headlights swinging wild the way trouble usually announced itself. Just black suits filling the sidewalk like water finding the shape of a container. Clara had spent 3 years working nights in an ER trauma bay. She thought she knew what fear sounded like. She'd never heard it this quiet before. She pressed her back to the wall beside the window, close enough to watch the shapes move past the glass, far enough to convince herself they couldn't see her shadow. Somewhere behind her in the dark, Dominic Blackwood shifted against the wall, blood soaking through the shirt at his shoulder, the copper smell of it thick enough to taste. His voice came out low, rough. "If that door opens," he said, "they won't let you walk out of here alive." 2 hours earlier, this apartment had just been her apartment. Chipped countertop, second-hand couch, a framed photo of her mother on the side table. Now it was something else entirely, and she was standing in the middle of it, still wearing the same wine-stained dress from a party she'd never wanted to attend, with no idea how any of this had happened, or why a stranger's blood was drying under her fingernails. 2 hours earlier, she'd have laughed if you told her this was coming. It had started as just another gala she didn't belong at. Chandeliers throwing gold light over silk and diamonds. A string quartet that never seemed to stop. The smell of expensive perfume thick enough to give her a headache. Clara wore a plain midi dress in a room built for anything but plain, and she felt every set of eyes slide past her like she was part of the furniture. She'd learned to expect that. What she hadn't expected was Victoria Langford cutting through the crowd toward her with a wine glass already tipping. The wine hit the front of her dress cold, then wet, then humiliating, in that order. "Sweetheart," Victoria said, loud enough on purpose for the whole terrace to hear. "This section's for the elite, not for a lost little duck who wandered off course." Laughter rippled out. Clara felt it land on her skin like something physical. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there soaked and sticky while a room full of strangers decided all at once that she was something to laugh at. She'd learned a long time ago that standing still hurt less than fighting back, that reacting only ever gave people more to work with. People who've been mocked enough times learn to freeze instead of run, not because they're weak, because freezing once felt like the only door that didn't lead somewhere worse. Nobody in that ballroom had any idea who she really was. Just a curvy nurse, quiet, easy to overlook, easy to forget by the time dessert came out. None of them knew that across the city, in a room none of them could get into, a dying man was about to need exactly what she had and nothing else. Not money, not connections, just her hands, and what 2 years in a trauma bay had taught them to do without her even having to think. Back in the dark apartment now, her hands moved fast, pressing gauze into the wound at Dominic's shoulder, some old muscle memory from the ER taking over where her fear left off. She checked the color of his skin, the rhythm of his breathing, the heat radiating off him even through the fabric of his ruined shirt. Near her feet, his gold pocket watch lay cracked open on the floor where it had fallen, still ticking, steady, absurd, calm against everything else happening in that room. Then her fingers found the old scar on his forearm, and she went still. "This isn't from a street fight," she said, quiet, almost to herself, tracing the raised line of it without meaning to. "This is a blade pattern. Family style. I stitched a stranger with this exact wound 2 years ago. No name on the chart. Nothing." She looked up and something shifted behind his eyes, sharp, sudden, like a door opening somewhere he hadn't expected one. He'd spent 2 years looking for that nurse. He'd dismissed her at a party 3 hours ago as just another face in an expensive room. Footsteps outside, multiplying. Boots on concrete, low voices, the metallic click of something being checked and rechecked. Dominic's hand closed around her wrist, firm, careful, like some part of him was still trying not to hurt her even now. "They're here." Clara looked at him straight on, heart slamming against her ribs, fear tangled up with something else she didn't have a name for yet. "Who are you?" She had no idea that the man bleeding on her couch had already decided, somewhere behind those pale gray eyes, that nobody in this city would ever touch her again. "If you were Clara, would you have opened that door, or stayed frozen and hoped it passed you by? Tell us below, because what happens next changes everything." 3 days before the gala, none of this existed for Clara. Her life was double shifts at Somerset General, the kind that blurred together until Tuesday felt like Thursday, and neither felt like anything at all. Sore feet, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead at 3 in the morning, the hum of machines, the smell of antiseptic that never quite left her clothes even after she showered twice. She'd stopped noticing the ache in her lower back by month 6, the way her shoes squeaked against the linoleum at the exact same spot near the nurse's station every single shift. Co-workers who laughed behind her back about her size, her cardigans, the way she dressed like she was trying to disappear into the walls of the break room. An ex who left her for someone thinner and told her, on his way out, arms already full of boxes, that she was forgettable. Said it so casually, like it cost him nothing, like the word wouldn't sit in her chest for the next 2 years, wouldn't come back to her at 2 in the morning on nights she couldn't sleep. She'd learned to keep her head down after that, to make herself smaller in rooms where she used to take up space without thinking about it. It's a quiet kind of damage, the way people teach you, piece by piece, to apologize for taking up space, long after they've forgotten they ever did it. Clara had gotten so good at it that she barely noticed anymore. The way you stop noticing a low hum in a room until someone finally turns it off and the silence feels almost too loud. The invitation came dressed up as a hospital order, official letterhead, a signature that looked close enough to real that she never thought to question it. Forged, though she didn't know that yet. Victoria's handwriting behind it, disguised in the sterile language of protocol. Clara never questioned an order. Why would she? Orders were the one thing in her life that made sense. Clear, simple, something to follow instead of something to feel. What she didn't know. Dominic had been watching her for weeks, quietly, from a distance she never once sensed. He'd found out, through the kind of channels only men like him have. Favors called in, records pulled from places that weren't supposed to exist. That a nurse at Somerset General had once treated an anonymous stab wound in the middle of the night and turned down every bribe afterward to give up a name. Turned down more money than she made in a year, more than once, without blinking. That kind of loyalty doesn't come along often in his world. Worth checking out in person, he'd decided. Worth more than checking out, if he was honest with himself, which he rarely allowed himself to be. A courier showed up at her door with a box, sleek and black, tied with a ribbon that cost more than her rent. Diamond bracelet inside, cold and glittering under the hallway light, and under it, a black key card, no markings, no explanation. She held the bracelet up to the light for a long moment, watching it catch and scatter, feeling the pull of it, the temptation of being given something beautiful for once in her life. She thought briefly of every time she'd stood in front of a store window and told herself things like that weren't for people like her. Then she mailed it back within the hour, wrapped it up as carefully as it had arrived, because she'd learned that gifts like that always came with a price tag nobody mentioned out loud. She kept the key card. Something about it nagged at her, a small itch at the back of her mind she couldn't quite scratch. The numbers stamped along its edge matched a code she'd seen once, scrawled in the corner of a medical file that had disappeared from the hospital's records without a trace. a file she'd looked for twice since and never found again. She clocked the connection instantly, and something cold slid down her spine when she did. People who've spent years being underestimated tend to notice things, small things, the details everyone else walks past without a second glance, because noticing was how they survived. It was a skill nobody ever thanked her for, the kind that only mattered in moments like this. That night on shift, a tray of pills hit the floor with a clatter that made half the ward jump. Elena Rossi, the one person in that building Clara actually trusted, the one who always saved her a seat at lunch and never once commented on her weight or her clothes, slipped a burner phone into her hand while pretending to clean up the mess, her fingers brushing Clara's palm in a way that felt deliberate, urgent. "Someone's watching your files," she whispered, not looking up, voice barely more than breath. "Watch who you talk to." Clara's stomach dropped. She spent the rest of her shift glancing over her shoulder at every closed office door, every quiet conversation that stopped a beat too fast when she walked past. Her own footsteps suddenly sounding foreign to her in hallways she'd walked 1,000 times. The next morning, she caught 2 administrators in a hallway, recording them without thinking twice, her thumb trembling over the phone's screen, talking about a payment from someone named Langford. Records that were supposed to stay sealed, mentioned so casually it turned her blood cold. Then the part that turned curiosity into real fear, the kind that kept her awake staring at her ceiling long after her shift ended, counting the cracks in the plaster instead of sheep. An entire supply of Rh null blood. Rare, one of the rarest types there is, the kind hospitals fought over and rationed like gold, kept vanishing from the hospital's private storage. Small amounts, untraceable unless you knew what to look for, unless you'd spent years learning to spot the gaps other people missed. She'd seen that blood type once before, in the chart of the man she'd stitched up 2 years ago, the one whose name she'd never learned, whose face she still sometimes saw in the space between sleep and waking. Dominic summoned her to a penthouse under the same fake pretense, another consultation, another forged order that felt too real to question. The elevator ride up had felt endless, her reflection warped and pale in the polished doors, her pulse ticking faster with every floor, her palms damp against the cool metal railing. This time they stood face to face, no crowd between them, no wine on her dress, just the 2 of them in a room too large and too quiet, floor-to-ceiling windows holding the whole glittering city like it belonged to him. "I don't need a doll to put on a shelf," he told her, flat, unreadable, his eyes never leaving her face, like he was testing her, gauging whether she'd flinch. "I need someone who can see the knife before it's thrown." She handed him the ledger, her fingers steady even though her chest wasn't. Found it behind a false panel, using the key card he'd sent, spending an hour crouched in a supply closet with a flashlight between her teeth before she found the seam in the wall, her knees aching against the cold tile, terrified someone would open that door before she finished. Page after page of transfers that lined up exactly with the missing blood, dates circled in her own careful handwriting. "You're not invisible to me," he said, quiet. Almost like he meant it more than the words could carry, like he'd been saving that sentence for the right moment and hadn't expected to feel anything when he finally said it. There's a specific kind of relief that hits when someone finally says out loud the thing you've felt for years and never spoken. It doesn't undo the old wound, but it lets you stand up a little straighter for the first time in longer than you can remember. Clara felt that relief land somewhere under her ribs, unfamiliar and warm, and she didn't trust it, not yet. But she didn't push it away either. Neither of them understood yet how far this went. The kindness she carried, the sharp mind she'd buried under years of doubting herself, it had already pulled her into something bigger than one dangerous man could control. And the clock on it was already running, ticking down toward a night neither of them saw coming. The gala. Victoria moved first, Wine down the front of Clara's dress, dressed up as an accident, executed with the practiced ease of someone who'd humiliated people before and gotten away with it every time. "Escort her out," she said, loud enough for every phone in the room to catch it live, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Laughter again, rising as the guards grabbed Clara's arms and started pulling her toward the door, their grip tight enough to bruise, her heels dragging against the marble in a way she knew everyone was watching. The old shame came rushing back up, hot, choking, filling her throat until she thought she might actually be sick right there on the marble floor. She could feel 100 phones angled toward her, could feel the moment being captured, and would live somewhere online forever. And for one terrible second, she thought she might just let them drag her out, let this be the story of her life, the way it had always been. Cruelty like that rarely comes from strength. Usually it's fear wearing a nicer coat. The loudest person in the room is often the one most afraid of being seen too clearly. Victoria smiled the way people smile when they need everyone else to feel small, so they don't have to look at what's actually small in themselves. Then the music stopped. Every guard straightened, spines snapping into place like they'd been struck. Capos who'd been laughing seconds ago stood up without being told to, chairs scraping back across the floor in a wave that rippled through the whole room. The silence had weight to it, physical, pressing down on every person present, like the air itself had been pulled out of the building, and nobody could quite catch their breath. Somewhere a champagne flute trembled against a tray, and nobody dared move to steady it. Dominic crossed that floor like the whole room had just shifted under him, like gravity itself answered to him. He pulled off his own coat and put it around Clara's shoulders. She was shaking, from the cold, from the wine, from all of it, and the warmth of the fabric against her skin felt like the first kind thing anyone had done for her in that entire building. It smelled like him, faintly, cedar and something metallic underneath, and she gripped the lapels without meaning to, like she needed something solid to hold on to. Then he turned to Victoria, low voice, the kind that makes people lean in just to catch the words. "You'll apologize," he said, "to the only guest in this room I actually trust." Gasps rippled outward, guest to guest, a wave of disbelief moving through silk and diamonds. He brought his family ring down against the table, one hard crack that echoed off the high ceilings, and the whole hall bowed their heads like a single organism responding to a single command. He pressed the cracked pocket watch into her hand, a quiet reminder, just between them, of the night that started all this. His fingers brushed hers, lingering a half-second longer than necessary, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with fear anymore. Clara's heart was still pounding, but it had changed shape somehow, the terror shifting into something she didn't have a name for yet. Clara lifted her chin. "I don't need a different dress to prove what I'm worth." Her voice didn't shake. She heard it herself, almost surprised by the steadiness of it, like some part of her had been waiting her whole life to say those words out loud in a room full of people who'd decided long before tonight that she didn't matter. It takes years to say a line like that and actually mean it. Dignity, once someone strips it away from you, doesn't come back with an apology. It comes back the second you decide you don't need one. Victoria's face went white. All that composure just gone, cracking apart in real time in front of the same crowd that had laughed with her minutes earlier. Dominic leaned in close, close enough that only she could hear him. "You saw what everyone else chose not to." For a second, Clara let herself feel it. Not shame this time, something closer to being seen, really seen, for the first time in her life. Warm and unfamiliar, and almost frightening in how good it felt. Neither of them knew yet that this one act, public, loud, impossible to take back, had already lit a fuse inside Dominic's own house, one that would send an army to Clara's front door before the night was over. By the time Clara made it home, the street had already gone quiet in the wrong way. Too quiet. the kind of silence that pressed against her skin and made every nerve in her body stand at attention before her mind had even caught up. Her key had slipped twice against the lock, her hands still not fully hers again. Dominic triggered a safe room hidden in the building's foundation. She never even knew it existed, had walked over the seam in the floorboards 100 times without ever guessing what lay beneath. 15 minutes, he told her, his voice clipped, urgent, the calm from the gala replaced by something sharper. That's what they had before the men outside found a way through. Clara's hands moved fast, sweat gathering at her temples despite the cold concrete around them, the low hum of the safe room's ventilation, the only sound besides her own breathing. Sorting through the ledger, pulse hammering in her ears loud enough to drown out her own thoughts, right on the edge of piecing the whole thing together when the door opened from the inside. Her breath caught in her throat. Marcus Hale walked in. Calm. Too calm, the kind of calm that told her everything wrong about this moment. She knew before he said a word. He was working with Victoria. She felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the ground she'd thought was solid revealing itself to be nothing of the sort. He pulled out fake evidence, papers he must have prepared days in advance, and said Clara had been feeding information to a rival family, that the key card in her pocket proved it. For 1 second, Dominic's eyes went cold, searching her face for a betrayal he clearly didn't want to find, and Clara felt that gaze like a physical thing, like being examined under a light too bright to hide anything from. Trust, even the real kind, gets fragile fast under pressure. The mind grabs the quickest explanation the second fear takes over, and suspicion always outruns the truth. It's not cruelty. It's just human. And it's exactly the moment most relationships quietly snap, the hairline crack nobody notices until it's already too late to repair. Clara didn't flinch. Her hands, which had been shaking moments before, went perfectly still, muscle memory from years of emergencies steadying her without her permission. She stepped forward, pointed at the dark stain on Marcus's sleeve. "That's not enemy blood," she said, steady now, her voice cutting clean through the tension in the room. "I've stitched enough wounds to know the difference. That's Dominic's, from the night I treated him. You're the one who put that knife in his shoulder." Silence, the kind that has texture, that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. Dominic's eyes cut from her to Marcus, and understanding hit him like cold water, his jaw tightening, something dangerous surfacing behind his expression that hadn't been there a moment ago. Clara pulled a tiny recorder out of the broken pocket watch, her fingers trembling now that the worst of it was over, adrenaline finally catching up to her. Played it back. Victoria's own voice, thin and tinny through the small speaker, talking about the stolen blood, the forged invitation, the whole plan to bury anyone standing in her way. Something shifted in Dominic. Protector, gone. Partner in its place. He looked at her like an equal now, something in his expression she'd never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not desire, but respect, plain and unmistakable. Clara stood beside him, steady, no more shaking, walking him through weeks of quiet digging she'd never told him about, her voice growing surer with every sentence, like she was finally allowed to take up the space she'd always deserved. What changed in that room wasn't just the evidence. It was Dominic realizing the steadiness he needed beside him doesn't come from muscle or money. It comes from someone who stays clear-headed exactly when fear is working hardest to take over. You can't demand that from a person. It only comes from what they've already survived. The fear that had gripped her minutes ago melted into something else, something unshakable, settling into her bones like it had always belonged there. But what waited on the other side of that door wasn't 15 men anymore, or 500. It was an entire empire, about to find out exactly who Victoria Langford really was. Once the evidence left Clara's hands, everything moved fast. The ledger, the recording, the whole forensic trail she'd built out of a hospital's forgotten files, each page another nail in a coffin Victoria had built for herself without realizing it. Within days, Victoria's alliances came apart in front of the council, one by one, voices in that room going from loyal to distant to openly hostile in the span of a single meeting. Marcus went down with her, his own transactions buried right there in the same paper trail, exposed under the same fluorescent cold lighting Clara had spent years working under without anyone noticing what she was capable of. The council chamber itself was nothing like Clara had expected. No chandeliers here, no orchestra. Just a long table of dark wood, worn smooth at the edges from decades of hands resting against it, and men who looked like they'd built empires out of silence and consequence. The air smelled faintly of cigar smoke that had probably soaked into the walls years before she was born. Clara stood near the door that first day, hands clasped tight in front of her to keep them from shaking, watching men who had once nodded politely at Victoria now refused to meet her eyes at all. Dominic stood before the full council and called off the engagement without a second's hesitation, his voice carrying none of the strain she might have expected from a man giving up power. Told them plainly, he'd rather lose the alliance her family offered than lose the one person who'd proven over and over that she could be trusted. Clara watched from the edge of the room, her chest tight, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. The sense of being chosen, not out of obligation, but on purpose. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, willing the sudden knot there to loosen, telling herself this wasn't a dream she'd wake up from in her old apartment with nothing but a ruined dress to show for it. They asked Clara to speak in front of that same council, the one that had watched her get dragged out of a ballroom not long before. The memory of that humiliation still fresh enough to sting when she walked into the room. Her mouth had gone dry the moment they said her name. She remembered, absurdly, standing at the nurse's station years ago, terrified to speak up about a doctor's mistake, and how she'd stayed quiet then, too. She thought of that version of herself now, and something in her refused to let history repeat. She didn't shrink, her palms were damp, her heart pounding, but she kept her spine straight and her voice level, and somewhere in the middle of speaking she stopped being afraid entirely. Men who'd laughed at her sat there in total silence, listening, some of them unable to meet her eyes. One older man near the end of the table, the kind of face that looked like it hadn't shown respect to anyone freely in 40 years, nodded once when she finished. Just once. It felt like an earthquake. Dominic handed her the family's financial records, right there, in front of everyone, the weight of the folder heavier in her hands than its pages should have allowed. Her fingers curled around the edges of it, and for a moment she just stood there, feeling the strange gravity of what she was holding. Not just numbers and transfers, but trust, real trust, handed to her in front of the very people who'd have laughed at the idea a month earlier. Put an outsider, someone they'd once dismissed outright, in a position none of them had ever seen given away before. He bent the rules of his whole world just to make room for her voice, and the silence that followed wasn't disbelief anymore. It was recognition. The pocket watch sat on the table between them, fixed now. New glass, hands steady, ticking with a quiet certainty that matched the moment. A reminder of everything that had changed since that first terrible night. The one where she'd knelt on her own floor with trembling hands and no idea what she was about to become. She glanced at it once, and for a strange, suspended second, she could still feel the ghost of that first night, the copper smell, the fear, the stranger bleeding under her hands who would end up changing the entire shape of her life. He took her hand in front of the room. "You saw what no one else did," he said. "That's why you were always the key." Something settled into Clara's spine, not loud, not dramatic, just true. She stood taller than she ever had, not because anyone gave her permission, but because she'd earned it herself, inch by inch, choice by choice, from a hospital hallway to a Mafia council room. Real confidence rarely shows up with fireworks. Usually, it just arrives quietly, the moment a person stops waiting for someone else to hand them their own worth. What was between her and Dominic had stopped being about protection a while ago. Now it was partnership, built on respect, not rescue, on two people who'd earned each other's trust the hard way. But even with justice done and the threat gone, both of them knew building something real together was only just getting started. Later, away from council rooms and chandeliers, in a quiet that felt earned rather than given, Dominic looked at Clara the way he'd never looked at anyone, like an equal. They stood on the balcony of the penthouse where all of this had truly started, the city spread out beneath them in a wash of gold and amber light, the same skyline she'd once seen from that endless elevator ride, terrified and unsure of herself. It looked different now, softer somehow, like the lights themselves had settled into something calmer to match the quiet in her chest. He put his family ring in her palm, the metal still warm from his own skin, not a demand, a promise, offered without a single word needed to explain what it meant. Clara turned it over in her fingers, feeling the worn edges, the weight of history pressed into something so small, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The wind moved between them, cool against her bare arms, and she realized she wasn't cold. Not the way she had been that first night, shaking in her own living room with a stranger's blood on her hands. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that came after a storm had finally passed all the way through. Then the twist that turned the whole story on its head. That first wound, the one from the very first night, wasn't some random attack at all. It was the last piece of a plot Marcus had been building for years, meant to take Dominic down from the inside, patient and quiet and nearly successful. Clara, without ever knowing it, had saved him from a conspiracy that had already been running long before she ever picked up a needle and thread for him, her hands doing the work before her mind had any idea what she was truly part of. Dominic told her this quietly, watching her face as the pieces clicked into place, watching her realize that the moment she'd thought was just an accident of fate had actually been the hinge the entire story swung on. She let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in her lungs for weeks. "So I didn't just stumble into this," she said, half to herself, turning the thought over the way she used to turn over a chart before signing off on it. "I was already part of it, before either of us knew." "You were the only part of it that mattered," he said. She smiled, steady, sure of herself now, in a way that felt new and permanent all at once. "I'm not afraid of being invisible anymore." There was a version of Clara, not so long ago, who would have needed someone else to convince her that was true, who would have waited for permission, for proof, for someone to say it first before she let herself believe it. That woman didn't disappear overnight. She'd shed her slowly, one humiliation survived, one steady breath at a time, until the fear that used to live behind her ribs finally ran out of room. Victoria got thrown out of the syndicate entirely, sent back to an ordinary life, working, of all places, at the same hospital where she once looked down on the woman she now had to answer to, her diamond-studded confidence replaced with a name tag and a schedule she couldn't control. Word reached Clara through Elena weeks later over coffee in the same break room where Clara used to shrink into her chair and eat lunch alone. Elena grinned over her cup. "You should see her now. Doesn't even look people in the eye anymore." Clara didn't feel triumphant hearing it. She felt something quieter, something closer to peace. There's a strange kind of justice in that. People who build their whole worth on looking down at others usually end up needing, more than anyone, the same mercy they never bothered to give. The syndicate that once mocked her now recognized her, in the open, completely. No longer the woman hiding in the corner, the one who changed everything, whose name people said now with something closer to reverence than pity. She still went back to Somerset General sometimes, part-time, because the work mattered to her, and she refused to let anyone tell her she had to choose one life over the other. She was still Clara, just no longer small in her own story. This story reminds us that true worth was never up to cruel people to decide, that quiet strength can carry more weight than any title ever could, and that the person everyone overlooks might just be the one who ends up changing it all. What did you think of Clara's turn from invisible to unstoppable? Drop a comment, hit like, share it, and subscribe for more.